Good morning. Oh, today's Wednesday. Today we're learning the fifth and final Perek of Maaseros. Today's shiur is sponsored Lila Nishmas Aaron Nachum Ben Simcha Cohen, Yeshua Morcha Ben Shepsel, Bracha Sarah Shmuel Leib, Abiram Moshe Ben Yosef. May the Neshamas all have an Aliyah. Mishnah Aleph, Perek Hey Mishnah Aleph starts off. Ha'oker shesolim mitoch shalo v'nata v'soch shalo. If someone uproots young plants from his field and replants them somewhere else in his field, Potter, he is not obligated to separate Maaseros from the plants before he replants them. Even though it's forbidden to plant produce from which Maaseros have not been separated, the prohibition applies only to produce that has become set for the Maaser obligation. Since these plants are not yet set for Maaser, and they therefore they may not be planted. They may be planted even though the Maaseros was not separated. Lakach b'mechubo the karka. If someone bought produce while it is still attached to the ground, Potter it's not chayv Maaseros. Laka l'shloach l'chavero. If someone picked partially grown plants in order to send them as a gift to his friend who will replant them, Potter, the friend is not obligated to be to mafresh Maaser before he replants them. Giving produce as a gift does not set the Maaser obligation, therefore they remain unset for Maaser. Elizabeth Azariah says, when partially grown plants are picked to be replanted, if similar plants are being sold in the market to be eaten, then these plants that are picked to be replanted are chayiv and maaser, because the plants that are sold in the market are legally considered to be processed and therefore subject to maaseros, even if they have not actually gone through any processing. And right, so then these plants also the same thing. Mishnah Beis. Mishnah Beis starts Ha'oker lefes with senonos b'toch shelo. If someone uproots a turnip or radishes from his field, v'noteya l'soch shelo zera, in order to replant them somewhere else in his field for the sake of producing seeds, chayev, he is chayev the mafresh Maaser from the vegetables before replanting them. Mifnei shehu garnon, because this act of uprooting them is considered their goren, meaning that the act that makes them fully processed and chayiv at Maaseros. Therefore, um, since the vegetables will harden and become inedible after they are replanted, the development as food is completed now when they are uprooted. Because of this, they are now considered fully set Maaseros and may not be planted until their Maaser has been separated. But seldom, if onions were stored in an attic, once they take root in the dirt floor of the attic, even though the owner did not plant them there or intend for them to take root, they are now attached to the ground and therefore tiharu tame. They have become purified from the ability to become tame, meaning that since they're mechuba the karka, they cannot become tame anymore until they're pulled out. Nafla aleim efoles hemagolim. If a building collapsed on the onions and debris and dirt covered them, but their leaves remain uncovered, then the onions are considered as though they were planted in the field, meaning that they are considered to be attached to the ground with regard to all the Torah's laws. And in this case, the onions are growing in the normal way, meaning that the roots are covered with dirt and the leaves are uncovered, and therefore they are considered to be planted in the ground, even though they were not planted intentionally. Mishnah Gimel, Lo Yimkar Adam es Perosov, a person may not sell his produce that is still attached to the ground, Mishabo the onus of Maaseros. Once the produce has reached the stage of Maaseros. The mi she'eno ne'eman al Maaseros is someone who is not trusted to separate Maaseros properly, more like a Maaretz, because it's forbidden to cause someone else to sin. Never selling such produce, which may not be eaten until Maaseros has been separated, to a person who might not separate Maaseros will likely cause that person to sin. Lo b'shviyis, and during Shemitah, when a person may not sell produce that has reached the stage of Maaseros, the fee shehu chashud al shviyis, to someone with me, shehu chashud al shviyis. You cannot sell it to someone who is suspected of violating the laws of Shemitah. Because he will likely cause him to sin by not following the proper halachos. The im bikru, and if some of the produce in the field ripened early and reached the stage of Maaseros, but the rest of the produce did not reach that stage, no till asepakoros the mocher es hashar. The owner removes the early ripening produce and may then sell the rest of the crop to someone who is not trusted regarding Maaseros of Shemitah. Since the remaining crop is not yet subject to the laws of Maaseros of Shemitah, there's no problem with selling it to a person who might violate those laws. Mishnah Dalet, Lo Yimkar Adam Es Tivno, a person may not sell his straw, the inedible stalks that are separated from the wheat kernels, Vez Gafto, or the pulp of his pressed olives, Vez Zagav, or the skins of his pressed grapes, the Mi She'enu Neman Ala Maaseros, is someone who is not trusted to separate Maaseros properly. If the Hotzi Mehen Mashkin, the buyer intends to extract the final drops of juice from them, meaning the olive pulp or the grape skins, or in the case of straw, to remove the few wheat kernels that are mixed in with it, for if the buyer extracted the grape or olive juice or removed the wheat kernels to eat, chayiv b'maasros, and the kernels or juice are subject to Maaseros. Trumah, however, such kernels and juice are exempt from trumah, because when a farmer separates trumah, the libo al hakatoim, he has in mind that he is taking trumah for his entire crop, even for the stalks that were not threshed. Val hatstadim, and for the grain on the sides of the pile, va'al mashvis sochateven, and for the kernels that are mixed in with the straw. Similarly, in the case of olives and grapes, the truma separated by the farmer covers all the wine and oil from the crop, even the drops that will later be extracted from the olive oil or grape skins. Is since the farmer's truma already covered the extra juice and kernels, the buyer does not have to separate truma from them. I totally forgot to add this on. I wanted to dedicate this year to Shimon David Benli Basara, who is having surgery this morning. May have a refuah shlema. Amen. Hello, Mishnah Hey. Hello, Keyach Sedei Yarak Bisturia. If a Jew buys a field of vegetables in Syria from a non-Jew, so the status of the vegetables depends on who owns them at the stage of Maaseros. If the Jew bought the field before the vegetables reached the stage of Maaseros, chayav, the vegetables are subject to Maaseros. Umishaba, the onus of Maaseros, but if he bought the field after the vegetables reached the stage of Maaseros, Potter, the vegetables are Potter from Maaseros because they were owned by a non-Jew when the laws of Maaseros would have been taken effect, and the produce of a non-Jew in Syria is not chayiv Maaseros. Loki kedarka v'halich. In this case, the Jewish buyer may harvest the vegetables in his usual manner, meaning that he can allow the vegetables to continue to grow and harvest them at the usual time, even though they will continue to grow while owned by a Jew. He does not have to separate mysis. However, he must harvest the vegetables himself. He may not hire workers to do the harvesting. And Yehuda says, if Yiska Pualim the Yilkut, he may even hire workers to harvest the vegetables. Shimon ben Gamliel says, when were these things said? That is, in what case are vegetables bought before the stage of mice was subject to mice? Bisman shekana karka, when the Jew bought the land along with the vegetables. Aval bisman shalokana karka, if he did not buy the land but merely bought the vegetables. Im ad shalom balo onas maisrus, then even if he bought them before they reached the stage of maisrus, pater, they are exempt from maisrus. According to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the very fact that the vegetables grew on a non-Jew's land exempts them from maisrus, even if the vegetables were owned by a Jew at the stage of maisrus. Produce in Syria subject to Maaseros only if a Jew owns both the produce and the land it is on when it reaches the stage of Maaseros. Rabbi says, even if a Jew bought vegetables after the stage of Maaseros, he must separate Maaseros by proportion. That is, he must separate for whatever percentage of vegetables grew after the sale, but not for the percentage that grew before the sale. Mishnah Vav. Hamasameh b'nasan mayim b'mida. If someone made temed and he poured a measure of water onto wine sediment and allowed it to soak, the matzah kadei midaso. And when the temed was ready, he found that the amount of temed was the same as the measure of water he had originally poured in. Pater, this temed is exempt from maasros, since the measure of liquid did not noticeably increase. The sediment obviously did not add a significant amount of wine to the beverage, and therefore the temed is not considered wine, but really wine flavored water, which is not subject to the chiyuv of maaser. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev. Rabbi Yehuda considers this temed subject to maaser, even if the liquid increased by only half a jug. But his reason is that in this case, the temed in fact contains a full jug's worth of wine. The reason the liquid did not increase by a full jug is because half of a jug's worth of water was absorbed into the wine sediment. Therefore, the beverage began with 3 jugs of water and now contains 2.5 jugs and 2.5 jugs worth of water and 1 jug worth of wine. Since more than 25% of the mixture is wine, the beverage is obligated in maasros. Matzah yoser al kadei midaso. If he found that the measure of temed was significantly more than the original measure of water, the liquid increased to the point that the wine is 25% of the total, so that maasros must now be separated. Motzi alav bimakom acher. He may separate maasros from a different place or from other wine. Lefi cheshbon, according to the proportion of wine in the temed. He does not have to separate maasros for the entire volume of temed, but only for the part of that which is wine. Chorei Mishnah Zayin. 2 more to go. Chorei hanemalim. The grain kernels were found in the holes of ants. Shalanu b'tzad ha'arama arema hachayavis, that spent the night next to a pile of grain that is subject to maasros, even if they are in a field that also contains other grain that is not yet subject to maasros. Elu chayavim, these kernels are chayav maaser. Sheyadua shemidvar hagomer gorin kol halayla. Because it is certain that the ants were dragging kernels from the pile of fully processed grain the entire night. Since the pile was right next to the hole, we can be sure that they took the kernels from them and not from somewhere else. Mishnah Ches. Finally, Mishnah Ches. Shum Baal Bechi. This is the law for Lebanese garlic. Ubatzel Sharichva, and onions from Richba. They grow in Richba. The Greasin Akilkin and Cilician split beans. This is Sicilian. Cilicia, they come from Cilicia, wherever that is. The Hadashim and mitzvahs and Egyptian lentils. So all these things. Rabbi Meir says, Av karkas, also carcass, which is the type of cabbage. Rabbi Yossi says, Av hakatanim, also kutnim, which is the type of lentil. The turim and hamisus, these species are all exempt from misus, since people do not usually plant these species. It can be assumed that they grew on their own in the wild and are not obligated to misus. I was going to say, because I never heard of any of these things, so obviously they're not that common to be planted and sold, so they're probably wild grown. Then we call Adam the Shvius, and these species may be purchased from anyone during Shemitah, even from someone who's choshed on selling produce that was unlawfully guarded. Because we're not concerned that they guarded these products because they're so inferior to the market, so it was going to waste their time with it. Zara lofa ayom, seed of wild loof. It's also a type of onion. It's a wild onion. There are Russian leek seeds. There are basalim, onion seeds. Zera lefis, b'shara zerune, gina she'inam nechalim, and other garden seeds that are not eaten. The turim and the maaseros are all exempt from maaseros because they are not edible. Then the kachim we call out b'shvius, and they be purchased from anyone during Shemitah because they're not chayiv in the laws of Shemitah because they're not edible. Sha'afa pisha v'yan trumah, and if these inedible seeds, which were designated as trumah and then planted, if vegetables grew from them, even though the fathers of the vegetables, meaning like the seeds from which they grow, are trumah, I mean elu yochelu. The vegetables are not trumah and may be eaten by a non-kohen, although usually something that grows from trumah has the status of trumah. That's only when the original trumah is edible. Since these seeds are not edible, the vegetables that grow from them do not have the status of trumah. Hajjan alach, Maseches Maaseros. Tomorrow morning we will start Maseches Maaseros Sheni, Chmer Hashem at 9:00. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful day.